The autumn of 1962 in Northern Virginia was defined by a lingering, suffocating tension. The world had just stepped back from the brink of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the collective relief was tempered by a residual, gnawing anxiety. In the suburbs of Washington, D.C., normalcy was a performance. Men in gray flannel suits commuted to government offices, housewives tended to manicured lawns, and children played in the streets, but everyone was watching the sky a little more closely than before. In the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods of Arlington, the daily arrival of the mail carrier was one of the few constants people could rely on. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat of civilization that persisted even when the geopolitical world seemed on the verge of collapse. John Martinez was the keeper of that rhythm for his section of Arlington. He was a veteran of the Postal Service, a man who had spent 12 years walking the same concrete miles, wearing down the soles of his shoes and memorizing the lives of the people on his route. He was a professional in a trade that most people took for granted. To the outside world, he was just a man with a leather bag. But to John, the mail was a tactile language. He knew his customers by the volume of their correspondence, by the handwriting on their letters, by the magazines they subscribed to. His hands had developed a sensitivity that rivaled a safecracker's. After handling millions of pieces of paper, his fingers could instantly gauge the weight, the texture, and the content of an envelope without him ever needing to look at it. It was muscle memory honed to an art form. On a Tuesday morning in late October, the routine was broken by an anomaly. It wasn't a dramatic event. There were no explosions, no sirens. It was just a standard, white business envelope sitting in a stack of sorting mail, destined for a townhouse on Wilson Boulevard. The return address indicated it was from a law firm in New York City. Visually, it was perfect. The typing was crisp, the stamp was placed correctly, the address was accurate. But as John picked it up to slot it for delivery, his hand sent a signal of confusion to his brain. The physics of the object didn't make sense. Legal correspondence was known for its heft: contracts, wills, affidavits, thick stacks of bond paper folded into thirds. This envelope, however, felt almost empty. It was too light to hold the heavy matters of law. The recipient was a Mr. Robert Chandler. John knew the name well. Chandler was a quiet resident at 1847 Wilson Boulevard, a man who lived a life of unremarkable privacy. He received utility bills, the occasional catalog, but rarely anything personal or urgent. John stood in the sorting room, the morning light filtering through the dust motes, holding the envelope between his thumb and forefinger. He weighed it, testing the balance. It felt like it contained perhaps a single sheet of paper, or maybe nothing at all. Most carriers would have simply shrugged and tossed it into the bag. It wasn't their job to question the contents, only to ensure the delivery. But John was a man who took pride in the details. The discrepancy bothered him. It was a sour note in a familiar song. He hesitated for a long moment, debating whether to flag it for insufficient postage or damage. But technically, it was fine. It had a stamp. It had an address. With a sigh of unease, he slotted it into his bag and headed out into the crisp October air. The delivery to Wilson Boulevard happened without incident. John walked up the path to the modest brick townhouse, lifted the metal flap of the mail slot, and pushed the envelope through. He heard the soft hiss of paper sliding across the floor inside. As he walked away, the feeling of wrongness refused to fade. It sat in the back of his mind like a splinter. He finished his route, went home to his wife, and tried to shake off the paranoia. He told himself he was letting the recent war scare get to his head. But the universe has a way of repeating its patterns. The very next morning, Wednesday, John was back at his sorting station when he froze. There, sitting in the pile for Wilson Boulevard, was another envelope. Same size. Same New York law firm return address. And, as he picked it up, the same impossible weightlessness. Lawyers do not send identical, single-page letters on consecutive days. They send bills monthly. They send contracts once. To see two identical missives in 24 hours was a break in the pattern of reality. John looked around the bustling post office. His colleagues were laughing, drinking coffee, complaining about the weather. They saw nothing unusual. But John knew he was holding something that didn't belong in the ordinary flow of commerce. He decided to break protocol. He took the envelope over to a strong desk lamp and held it directly against the bulb. He wasn't opening mail, that was a federal crime, but he was inspecting it. The light bled through the high-quality paper, revealing the fibers. Inside, there was no folded letter. Instead, he saw a faint, dark shadow. It wasn't a check, and it wasn't a note. It looked like a tiny imperfection, a speck of dust trapped between the layers of the paper, or perhaps a small, dense dot glued to the inside. A cold realization washed over him. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system. Someone was sending something to Robert Chandler that was meant to be hidden, something that required the camouflage of a legal letter to move through the federal mail system unnoticed. John knew he needed help. He couldn't go to his supervisor, they would likely tell him to just deliver the mail and stop asking questions. He needed someone who understood that the postal service could be weaponized. He needed a postal inspector. He thought of Tommy Rodriguez. They had grown up together, played sandlot baseball, and entered the postal service around the same time. But while John stayed on the streets carrying the bag, Tommy had moved into the inspection service, investigating fraud and theft. John used his lunch break to make a call from a public phone booth. He kept his voice low, shielding the receiver with his hand. "Tommy, I need you to look at something. It's weird. It's probably nothing, but my gut is telling me it's something bad." They agreed to meet at a diner on Columbia Pike, a neutral ground away from the prying eyes of the main office. John arrived with the envelope tucked securely in his jacket pocket, treating it like it was made of radioactive glass. When he slid it across the Formica table, Tommy didn't laugh. He saw the look in John's eyes. He picked up the envelope, not casually, but with the reverence of a bomb disposal technician. He felt the weight. He frowned. Tommy pulled a small jeweler's loop from his pocket, a tool of his trade. He spent minutes examining the edges, the seal, the paper grain. The diner noise faded into the background as the inspection dragged on. Finally, Tommy lowered the envelope. He looked at John, and his face had lost all its color. The easygoing expression of an old friend was gone, replaced by the hard, terrified look of a man who realizes he is holding a live wire. "John," he whispered, leaning across the table. Where exactly did you get this? My route, John replied, his throat dry. Wilson Boulevard. We need to go, Tommy said, standing up abruptly and leaving money on the table for coffee they hadn't touched. We need to make a call to the FBI. Right now. This is way bigger than mail fraud. The drive to the FBI field office in Alexandria was a blur of silence and tension. John sat in the passenger seat of Tommy's unmarked sedan, clutching the door handle, watching the familiar streets of Northern Virginia pass by like a film reel from someone else's life. Within an hour, he was seated in a windowless room with cinder block walls, the air stale with cigarette smoke and the smell of cooling coffee. Across the metal table sat two men who looked as if they had been carved from granite, their suits dark and their expressions unreadable. The older agent introduced himself as Special Agent Crawford. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he carefully placed the plastic-bagged envelopes on the table between them. He looked at John with an intensity that made the mailman want to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. Mr. Martinez, Crawford said, his voice gravelly, we need you to walk us through your route. We need to know everything about Robert Chandler. Every habit, every visitor, every piece of trash you've ever seen him put out. John talked until his throat was dry. He described the rhythm of Wilson Boulevard, the way Chandler's house always seemed uninhabited until the mail slot clacked. He described the man's nondescript appearance, his polite but distant nod, the way he never seemed to have family or friends visiting for the holidays. He explained the meticulous nature of Chandler's existence, a life so average it felt curated. The agents listened, taking notes in shorthand, exchanging glances that John couldn't interpret. Then, the younger agent, Morrison, leaned forward and dropped the bombshell. He explained what John had actually found. It wasn't just a letter, it was a carrier for a microdot. He described a technology where a full page of intelligence, troop movements, schematics, diplomatic cables, could be photographically reduced to the size of a single punctuation mark. That tiny speck of dust John had sensed between the paper layers was a library of stolen secrets. Crawford took over, his tone grave. They had been hunting a Soviet cell in the D.C. area for months, chasing ghosts and shadows. They knew information was leaking from high-level sources, but they couldn't find the pipeline. They had tapped phones and followed diplomats, but the network remained invisible. John, with his calloused fingers and mailman's intuition, had just handed them the keys to the kingdom. Chandler wasn't just a quiet accountant, he was likely an illegal, a deep-cover officer operating without diplomatic immunity. But then came the request that made John's blood run cold. They couldn't arrest Chandler yet. If they took him down now, the rest of the network would go dark. They needed to map the entire web. They needed to know who was sending the letters and who Chandler was passing the information to. And to do that, they needed the mail to keep flowing. They needed John to go back to work tomorrow morning and deliver the mail as if nothing had happened. The next week was a masterclass in psychological endurance. John returned to the post office, sorting the mail with hands that he willed to be steady. Every time he saw an envelope from the fictitious New York law firm, his heart hammered against his ribs. He had to slot it, bag it, and carry it down the street, knowing he was essentially acting as a courier for the KGB. The FBI had swarmed the neighborhood, but they were invisible. John knew they were there, in the repair van parked down the block, in the window of the empty apartment across the street, perhaps even jogging through the park. But walking up the path to 1847 Wilson Boulevard felt incredibly lonely. Each time he reached for the mail slot, he expected the door to fly open, expected Chandler to know that the game was up. He had to smile, wave to neighbors, and act the part of the carefree mailman while carrying the weight of national security in his leather satchel. The surveillance operation was massive and suffocating. The FBI established a 24-hour perimeter around Chandler's townhouse. They cataloged his every movement, analyzing his grocery runs and his commute to the import-export firm. On the surface, Chandler was the perfect American citizen. He paid his taxes, mowed his lawn, and never caused a scene. But the agents noticed a pattern emerging in the static of his routine. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, the routine shifted. Chandler would leave his house at exactly 7:15 p.m. He would walk 3 blocks to a bustling commercial strip and enter a small, family-run Italian restaurant called Gino's. It was a popular local spot, noisy and crowded, the kind of place where you could disappear in the chaos of clattering dishes and animated conversations. Chandler always sat in the same rear booth. He always ordered the veal parmesan. He read his newspaper, ate slowly, paid in cash, and left. It seemed innocent enough, a bachelor's habit. But the anomaly was in the return trip. The walk to the restaurant took 10 minutes. The walk home, however, always took 45 minutes. He would take circuitous routes, doubling back through quiet residential streets, stopping to look at shop windows. The FBI analysts were convinced this was where the handoff happened. They scoured the route for dead drops, hollow fence posts, loose bricks, magnetic containers under mailboxes. They looked for brush passes, where an operative might bump into him in the dark. But they found nothing. The streets were empty. Chandler never met anyone. He just walked. The team was frustrated, they knew the transfer was happening, but they were blind to the mechanism. Agent Morrison, reviewing the logs, had a moment of clarity. They were obsessing over the walk home, assuming the transfer of information happened in the dark. But what if the walk was just a cleaning run, a counter-surveillance measure to ensure he wasn't being followed after the deed was already done? What if the exchange happened right under their noses, inside the restaurant? They pulled the surveillance tapes from inside Gino's. The footage was grainy, shot from a concealed camera that struggled with the restaurant's low lighting. They watched hours of Chandler eating, drinking, and reading. It was mind-numbingly boring until they focused on the service. They noticed that midway through every meal, a specific waiter would approach the table to refill Chandler's water. It wasn't his assigned server. It was an older man, thin, with a mustache, who moved with an efficiency that made him blend into the background. He would approach the table with a fresh glass of water, place it down, pick up the half-empty glass Chandler had been using, and walk away. The motion was fluid, practiced, and identical every single time. It happened in seconds. The FBI zoomed in. The glasses looked identical. Standard restaurant tumblers. But the exchange was too ritualistic. They realized the genius of it. The microdot wasn't in an envelope or a hollow coin. It was concealed in the base of the glassware. Chandler would place the dot in a hollowed-out section of the glass bottom during his meal. The waiter would retrieve it under the guise of customer service, taking the intelligence straight into the kitchen. The raid was scheduled for a Friday night. The tactical teams briefed in a warehouse miles away, preparing for a simultaneous strike. They couldn't risk a standoff in a crowded restaurant. They waited until the exchange occurred. They watched on the monitors as the waiter, identified as Nikolai Ivanov, picked up the glass. As he pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the FBI moved in. Agents burst through the rear kitchen exit and the front door simultaneously. Ivanov tried to dash toward the alley but was tackled before he could dispose of the glass. In the dining room, Chandler was swarmed in his booth before he could reach for a weapon or a cyanide pill. The restaurant fell silent as the reality of the Cold War crashed into their Friday night dinner. The search of Ivanov's apartment revealed a spy's paradise. It was a fully equipped command center hidden in a residential complex. They found high-powered radio transmitters capable of burst transmissions to Moscow. They found jars of invisible ink, one-time pads for encryption, and a darkroom setup specifically designed to read and create microdots. But the real treasure trove was at Chandler's townhouse. Behind a false wall in his study, agents discovered the archives of a decade-long betrayal. There were stacks of files on Pentagon personnel, copies of classified State Department cables, and technical manuals for advanced radar systems. The network had been bleeding the American military establishment dry, drop by drop, for 8 years. The arrest of Dmitry Volkov, living under the alias Robert Chandler, was not the end of the operation. It was merely the pulling of a loose thread that would unravel a tapestry of treason. The FBI cryptanalysis team descended upon the documents recovered from his townhouse, working around the clock to break the ciphers. Among the mountains of stolen data, they found a single, handwritten note containing a phone number. The number was encrypted, but the Bureau broke the code within 72 hours. It traced back to a surprising and disturbing source, a residence in the upscale neighborhood of Georgetown. The occupant was Dr. Frederick Walsh, a distinguished 62-year-old professor of Soviet history at Georgetown University. Walsh was a pillar of the Washington academic community, a man who regularly consulted for the State Department. Walsh's biography seemed impeccable. He was a respected scholar, widely published, and known for his keen insights into the Soviet mind. But the FBI investigation revealed a darker history. He had been recruited by the NKVD, the KGB's predecessor, in Berlin immediately following World War II. For 17 years, while posing as a loyal American academic, he had been funneling high-level policy thinking directly to Moscow. The revelation sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Walsh wasn't stealing technical schematics, he was betraying the strategic mindset of the American government. He had access to classified briefings and private dinners where the future of U.S. foreign policy was debated. His betrayal meant the Soviets had been reading the American playbook before the plays were even called. The paranoia that followed was palpable. The FBI launched a massive dragnet, opening investigations into dozens of diplomats, professors, and civil servants who had associated with Walsh or Volkov. While many of these leads proved to be dead ends, the pressure yielded results. 3 additional Soviet agents operating in the D.C. area were identified and quietly apprehended in the months that followed. John Martinez watched these events unfold from the periphery. The FBI kept him at arm's length, informing him only that his discovery had been instrumental. He wasn't told the names of the traitors or the specifics of the data they had stolen. He was left with the heavy, silent knowledge that the envelopes he had held in his hands were part of something that could have shifted the balance of global power. His reward for this service was modest, almost comically so in comparison to the stakes. He received an official letter of commendation signed by the director of the FBI, thanking him for his contribution to national security. Along with the letter came a cash bonus of $500. It was a significant sum for a mailman in 1962, but it was hardly a king's ransom. John didn't complain. He and his wife, Maria, used the money to take their 2 children on a vacation to Disney World. There was a profound irony in that trip, a family enjoying the quintessential American experience, funded by the disruption of a plot to destroy the American way of life. It was the only tangible evidence John ever had of his secret life as a counterintelligence asset. He returned to his route, walking the same streets, delivering mail to the same houses. But the innocence of the job was gone. Every envelope now carried a potential weight, a secret meaning. He found himself pausing over letters that felt too thick or too light, wondering if another Volkov was hiding behind the next door. But he never found another one. Lightning, it seemed, struck only once. The years rolled by, turning into decades. The Cold War dragged on, a stalemate of proxy wars and nuclear standoffs. John Martinez continued to walk his route in Arlington, a fixture of the community who aged gracefully alongside the neighborhoods he served. He retired in 1978, hanging up his leather satchel after nearly 30 years of service. His last day was a local event. The families on his route, the Johnsons, the O'Connors, the Patels, came out to their porches to wave goodbye. Mrs. Henderson, still living on 5th Street, baked him a cake. To them, he was just John the mailman, the reliable guy who knew their kids' names and always had a smile. They had no idea they were saying farewell to a man who had once stood on the front lines of national defense. At his official retirement party at the post office, his old friend Tommy Rodriguez appeared. Tommy was a senior postal inspector by then, a man with gray in his hair and the weight of command on his shoulders. They didn't speak about the microdots or the water glasses. They didn't have to. Tommy simply shook John's hand, a firm, lingering grip that conveyed a respect deeper than words could express. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later, John watched the news from his living room recliner. He felt a complicated mix of relief and nostalgia. The great enemy was gone. The shadow that had defined his entire adult life had lifted. He wondered about Volkov and Ivanov. Were they alive? Had they returned to a Russia that no longer existed? Even as the secrets of the Cold War began to be declassified, John maintained his silence. He never sought credit. He never called a newspaper to tell his story. The letter from the FBI director hung in his study, a quiet reminder for his eyes only. He understood something that the fame seekers never would: the job itself was the reward. Doing it right, when it mattered, was enough. John Martinez passed away in 2003 at the age of 76. His funeral was a modest affair, attended by family, friends, and former colleagues from the Postal Service. But there was one figure in the back row who didn't fit in. An elderly man in an immaculate dark suit sat alone, his posture rigid, his eyes respectful. It was Agent Crawford, long retired from the bureau. He hadn't spoken to John in 40 years, but he had come to pay his respects to the man who had cracked the toughest case of his career. He left without introducing himself to the family, a ghost from a past life acknowledging a debt that could never be fully repaid. The story of the mailman and the spy is more than a historical footnote. It is a testament to the power of the ordinary individual. In an age of satellites and cyber warfare, we often forget that the human element remains the most critical variable. Technology can monitor the world, but it takes a human being to notice when something simply feels wrong. The microdots are gone, replaced by encrypted data streams. The dead drops have moved from hollow table legs to the dark web. But the need for vigilance remains. The world is still full of secrets hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and the integrity to notice them. John Martinez proved that you don't need a badge or a security clearance to change history. You don't need to be a superhero. You just need to care about your work. You need to pay attention to the details. Because sometimes, the difference between safety and catastrophe is nothing more than the weight of a single envelope in the palm of your hand.